Welcome to our third and final State of Democracy lecture of the year. I'm Grant Reher, Director of the Campbell Public Affairs Institute, and I'm very pleased to welcome back to Maxwell our former colleague Arthur Brooks. Before I introduce him more fully, I want to offer some thanks first to the Dean's Office for supporting the series and for technical support, the Information and Computing Technology Group, and in particular Tom Fazio. I also want to thank WRVO for rebroadcasting this event. Thanks as well to my colleague Elizabeth Cohen, who helps organize the series, and Bethany Wallowender and Kelly Coleman, who work in the Institute and help put together these events. And in particular, I want to thank Marilyn Morris Malmuth from the class of 1951, who has generously sponsored this lecture. In addition, while I have you here, let me also invite you to an upcoming lecture in a different series that we are starting. On Tuesday, April 10th, former senator and presidential candidate, and I suppose I should add Basketball Hall of Famer, Bill Bradley will deliver the inaugural lecture in our new series, the Tanner Lectures on Ethics, Citizenship, and Public Responsibility, and it will be held in this room at 7 o'clock. Today we'll employ 6 o'clock, I'm sorry, 6 o'clock, thank you, 6 o'clock. Today we'll employ our traditional format for the State of Democracy lectures. You'll hear first from Arthur and then more briefly from two faculty respondents. Arthur will then have, even more briefly, the opportunity to respond to their reactions. And following that, we'll ask you to get involved and pose questions and offer points. And then, of course, we'll continue the conversation out in the foyer over food and drink. Well, first let me introduce the two respondents. They deserve a longer introduction, but I want to get us into the conversation as quickly as possible. Christy Anderson is Chappell Family Professor of Citizenship and Democracy here in Maxwell. She's written on women and politics and immigrant political incorporation, among other topics, and she also holds local political office. Lisa Dolak is the Angela S. Cooney Professor of Law at SU's College of Law. Her expertise is in patent law, judicial procedure, and media coverage of the law. And like Professor Anderson, she's a panelist on the Ivory Tower Half Hour on WCNY, which you'll be able to catch at home after our lecture here. Now to Arthur Brooks. Arthur is the president of the American Enterprise Institute, a leading think tank in Washington, D.C. Prior to heading up AEI, he held the Bantle Chair of Business and Government Policy here at Maxwell and was a professor in what was then called our Public Administration Department. Arthur has written or co-written 9 books, including his soon-to-be-released The Road to Freedom. Other titles include The Battle, How the Fight Between Free Enterprise and Big Government Will Shape America's Future, and Who Really Cares? Who Gives, Who Doesn't, and Why It Matters. Arthur has also been a consultant for the RAND Corporation, and for 12 years prior to that, he was a professional French horn player with, among other organizations, the Barcelona City Orchestra. And that last piece leads me in a way to the point I'll end with. When he was at Maxwell, I always found Arthur to be wide-ranging, insightful, clever, reasonable, and nice. All qualities that I can say, as someone who doesn't always agree with his point of view, can make him at times almost aggravatingly effective in making an argument. So I'm especially looking forward to having him sort out the future of conservatism for me. Arthur, welcome back.
Thank you, Grant. Thank you, Grant. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to all of you for taking some time out of your beautiful Friday afternoon to come hear these remarks. I've been looking forward to this. As many of you know, as Grant just told you, I was a professor here for 7.5 years. All of what I consider to be my important intellectual work was done here. This is the place where I feel like I had the ideas that shaped how I see the world. When you see how I see the world, you might be saddened by that fact. But it's an honor for me to be invited back. As I told you, I have been looking forward to it. Grant asked me to talk about the future of American conservatism. And the reason he asked me to do that was because I'm the president of an institution that's been around since 1938 and has been squarely at the center of the American conservative movement. To be more precise, the American Enterprise Institute is not a conservative movement organization per se. It's an organization that's dedicated to free enterprise. Our mission statement is that maximizing liberty, increasing individual opportunity, and strengthening the free enterprise system lead the most people to the best life. That's basically what we do our work for, and that intersects with the conservative movement in some ways, and in some ways, in fact, it doesn't. But I am going to give you what I think is a vantage from a front row seat in the middle of the American conservative movement, and I'm going to tell you what I think the future is for American conservatives. I don't want to start by assuming there is a healthy future for American conservatism. As a matter of fact, I'm not really very bullish on the American conservative movement. I think there's some question of whether or not it will be healthy, whether or not in 20 years there will be people who call themselves American conservatives. And to give you a head start on the points I'm going to make today, I want to tell you a story that I think sums up the big problems that American conservatives have today. It's a story about an economist like me. An economist who decides he wants to get away from it all one day. So he gets in his car and he drives out of town. He gets onto a country road and immediately gets lost. He's never been out in the country before, doesn't know his way around, doesn't have his GPS, sees nothing but a little country farmhouse on the side of the road. So he stops, knocks, asks for directions, says, "I'm lost. Can you tell me how to get back to Washington, D.C.?" The farmer says, "Sure, I see you city guys like this all the time. Here's how you get back," and he gives him careful directions. And the economist thanks the farmer, and he's turning to leave, and he notices on the side of the house a field of sheep. Now, he's always on the lookout for a profit-making opportunity, because he's an economist. And he says to the farmer, "Sir, I'd like to make you a wager. If I can tell you in 10 seconds the exact number of sheep in your field, can I have one?" The farmer says, "Sure, I guess. There's no way you could tell me how many sheep there are in 10 seconds. There are hundreds." He says, "Watch this." He applies a complicated set of mathematical heuristic devices in rapid succession, and at the end of 10 seconds, he says, "You, sir, have 632 sheep." The farmer says, "That's amazing. I have no idea how you did that, but I'm as good as my word. Pick out the one you like." So the economist goes into the field, picks out a sheep, and is walking back to his car. Now the farmer stops him and says, "Just a second. Before you leave, I got a wager for you. If I can tell you what you do for a living, can I have my sheep back?" The economist says, "There's no way you could know that. You just met me. Sure, you're on." The farmer says, "You're an economist." He says, "It's amazing. How did you know that?" He said, "Simple. You got all the numbers right, but you're walking off with my dog." That's the problem that conservatives have today. We're getting all the numbers right, but we're getting the big point wrong. We're not making a compelling argument to Americans. And to cut to the chase here, we're not making a moral argument for what we believe about the future of our country. And any political movement that can't make a moral case compellingly to Americans is going to lose. So I'm going to tell you what I think conservatives need to say to win in 2012 and in 10 years and 20 years from now. And whether they take my advice or not is another matter. We'll have to wait and see. So here's my outline. I'm going to tell you why American conservatives are not winning the political debate today, despite what you might hear, despite what sometimes you might even think by looking at political data. Second, I'm going to give you the strategy that I think we need if anybody wants to ensure that there's a future of American conservatism, and I'm going to tell you what I think it all means. Then I'm going to turn it over to my friends to hear what they have to say. Okay, first I'm going to start with a few disclaimers. Number one, I'm not a political scientist. You know, there's nothing more irritating to political scientists than an economist who's pretending to be one. That's just the worst. And economists do that all the time. We economists think that since we have a good grasp of empirical methods, we can do anything. We can do anybody's job better than they can. I'm not doing this. As a matter of fact, this is not an academic talk. This is intended as a talk from a policy practitioner from the vantage of inside sort of the political and policy machine. The second disclaimer I want to make is that I'm not going to try to convince you to become conservatives. That would be really great, but I lived here for a long time, and I know that it's not going to work. So let's just say I'm going to tell you kind of what I know and what I think, and this is more analysis than trying to convince you, because I'm quite sure that you have your opinions and they're well held, and I respect that. The third is I'm going to focus on free enterprise and not other aspects of conservatism. I'm not going to be talking about national security or social issues. I'm going to be talking about just free enterprise today. Now, why is that okay to do, right? And I'm going to show you why that's okay to do. The following list comes from CNN. Every month, CNN asks a large group of Americans, they ask them, what are the most important issues to you in the upcoming presidential election, congressional election, in American public policy, whatever it is. Every month. They've been doing it for years and years and years. What are the most important issues to you? This is last month, but it's the same every month unless there's some really big crisis in national security. This is what it always looks like. Now, look at that for a second. And now I'm going to summarize that list for you, okay? The next slide is going to summarize this list. Here's what this list really says boiled down. Here are the 9 things Americans care about the most, okay? That's what Americans care about. You can talk about gay marriage if you want. Americans don't care about it very much. You can talk about immigration if you want. Americans don't care about it. You can talk about, now, look, I know you care. We're in a university community. This stuff matters a lot more to us than it does to most Americans. If you want to connect with what people are really thinking about, you have to ask them what they're thinking about, and it kind of comes down to this. So this is what we need to be focusing on. But there's a problem. And the problem is, when we look at those issues, we want to talk about money. We say these are pocketbook issues. And as soon as we start talking about money, we're into the whole realm of materialism. And as soon as we're into materialism, we're out of the realm of morality. And then you can't make a moral case. And as soon as you are unable to make a moral case, you lose the argument. Okay, now, I'm going to make this point a little bit more vividly in a second, because I'm actually going to start talking to you about the whole subject of morality in a minute. I'm going to talk to you about the research on how moral judgments get made. But before I do that, I want to show you the evidence that in point of fact, and this may be good news to some of you, bad news to others of you, American conservatives are losing the debate today. Here's the evidence. I hear all the time that America is a conservative country, right? Very conservative country. If you compare us to Holland, or you compare us to Italy or Spain or Japan or Taiwan for that matter, America looks like a really right-wing place. And here's kind of how we base those judgments. If you say to Americans, do you believe the free enterprise system is the best system for America's economy despite severe ups and downs? If you ask them that question, 70% say yes. They say yes over and over and over again. You ask that to the French, 30% say yes. Okay, that's a fundamental difference. These are really big differences between the two countries. You say, well, America is a much more conservative country. If you ask about limited government, constitutionally limited government, you say, do you think the government's too big, provides too many services? Do you believe that Americans are mollycoddled? That kind of 70% say yes. Lots of people say, now, not all of you agree with that, but 70% of Americans consistently give this answer. It doesn't matter the poll, it doesn't matter the time, it doesn't matter how you word the question. One of the things that I do in public opinion is I make sure of those things, so we're not cherry picking the samples here. This is really a robust result. So you might come away with it saying, yeah, this is a completely right-wing country compared to our competitor nations. But then you look at the data. Then you look at how people really act and what's really going on, and the story kind of changes. Look at this graph here. This is an odd sort of conservative victory. This graph shows you the percentage of GDP that's being laundered through the government, that's being sent through the government. Go back to 1940, end of the big New Deal buildups. People were outraged by how much of the GDP in America the government was occupying. My institution, founded in 1938, was founded on the basis of the idea that the government was taking over too much of GDP. 1940, that was 15% of GDP. Fast forward to 1980, when Ronald Reagan was elected, it was 30%. Ronald Reagan promised to make that smaller. When he left office, it was 32%. When George W. Bush left office, it was 33%. Today, depending on the statistics you look at, it's either 36 or 39%. The Congressional Budget Office, strictly nonpartisan, tells us in the year 2038 that will be 50% of the American economy. 50% of American GDP. Americans will work from January 1st through June 30th to pay for the government by 2038. Now, for some of you, you might say, okay. But for a lot of people around America, they say, that's terrible. And that the main conclusion is, of course, that's not very conservative, because actually that we are not lower, we are higher than a lot of European governments right now. Now, there are a lot of other measures of this too. What percentage of Americans take more out of the tax system than they put in? In other words, they use more in the value of government services than they pay for. The answer is 70%. What percentage of Americans have no federal income tax liability? The answer is 51%. These are the characteristics of a social democratic society like Europe. Conservatives aren't winning. If you look at these data, every one of these things is a trend. It goes after decade after decade after decade. Conservatives are fooling themselves if they think that they are winning these big policy debates. They can win a few elections, but they're not winning overall. So here's the paradox of American government. Huge majorities say they love the free enterprise system and they love limited government, but big majorities favor public spending that's driven up the cost of the budget and deficits. Big majorities favor the kinds of spending. So for example, do you believe that the Social Security system should be altered in any way? 77% of Americans say no. Do you believe that the government should give free health care to all Americans? 64% of Americans say yes. You can't turn these things around when people have these public opinions, at least if they're reflected in our public policies. Now, part of this paradox says that people demand effectively high levels of government services and drive us toward a European-style social democracy, but also the data tells us that we hate it. 81% of Americans say that they are dissatisfied or very dissatisfied with the way we are being governed. That's the highest level in the history of keeping data on that subject. These data are kept by the Gallup polling organization. They've been run since 1970. The highest level ever is today. It's 81%. The second highest level was 77%, which was when Wall Street melted down in 2008, September. And before that, it was 66% the week that Nixon resigned after Watergate. In other words, this is the worst it's ever been. We're getting all the stuff that we ask for. We don't like it, and we're still asking the government to do more and more. What do we do to turn it around? Well, some people don't want to turn it around. But if you do, if you're conservative, the question is, what are you going to do? What am I going to do? Because I want to turn it around. I don't think this is a good thing. And I actually look at the data and go, I wish we were winning, but we're not. So what do? First thing is explain it. What's the explanation for the fact that the government is growing and growing and growing, and we get a welfare state that's larger and larger? And there are three explanations. There's a liberal explanation, there's a conservative explanation, and there's a correct explanation. And I'm going to give you all three. The liberal explanation is that we don't really want the free enterprise system as we talk about it. It's kind of sentimental. It's like looking back to the Eisenhower administration or something and say, wasn't life better then? Dad came home after work. The kids were playing out on the street and they weren't in danger. I Love Lucy was funny, right? All that stuff, of course, is wrong. I mean, all the memories that we have of a better time, generally speaking, are not accurate. I Love Lucy wasn't funny, for example. And the same is true, according to a lot of liberals, that our sentimentality about the free enterprise system is sort of false, too. We say we want it, but we don't really want it. We don't want that stuff. We want a big government that takes care of us, just like the Europeans. If you read Paul Krugman in the New York Times, that's basically what he says. Week after week after week. This is what Americans want. This is what Americans need. Now, conservatives counter. They say, no, that's not right. That's not right. Here's what the real explanation is. We simply haven't made the case for economic efficiency. We need to take 5 more pounds of data on fiscal consolidation and balanced budgets and shove it down the throats of Americans. And when they finally get their fill of all the data that show that economic efficiency is better than the alternative, they're going to say, yeah, that's right. Let's go back to free enterprise. So we need to show them that, if we don't balance the budgets right now, if we don't get a good kind of a set of policies about carried interest, a territorial system for the repatriation of profits and all that stuff that economists talk about, if we don't talk about that more clearly and give Americans more data, we're never going to win this argument. That's wrong. That explanation is wrong. I know it's wrong because I run a free enterprise think tank. I'm an economist. I was a university professor. Look, if it came all down to looking at data on economic efficiency, we would have won because that's my whole career in a nutshell. Let me tell you, it was very depressing for me to put point number 2 up there and tell you that it's not right because I wish it were. But that's not getting the job done either. That's not going to solve the problem. That's not the right explanation for the paradox of big government. The right explanation, in my view, is that Americans have not heard the consistent and compelling moral argument for the free enterprise system. And that's the argument that I'm going to try to give you today. I'm not going to pretend you're going to agree with it, But this is the argument that I believe personally is true and good and right, and I think it will win if it's adopted. Okay, now let's talk about morality a little bit, because you can't just throw around moral argumentation and not get a little bit deeper, at least not when you're on a university campus, you can't do that. So let's talk about morality a little bit. And I'm going to give you a 2-minute lesson in brain science. Now, as an economist, once again, I promised that I wouldn't try to colonize somebody else's profession. I'm really not a neurologist. But there is a little bit of literature on moral judgments that shows very interesting things about the human brain. All of this is covered in a new book that I have coming out on May 8th that Grant talked about. So if you're interested in this, there's a lot of footnotes and literature and things I can draw your attention to. But basically, it comes down to this. There's a part of your brain, it's called the medial prefrontal cortex. It's the part of your brain right behind your forehead. That part of your brain does lots and lots of amazing modern things. It's really the most modern part of your brain, evolved latest. And it does amazing things like executive functions. If you live in a big city that has complicated traffic, like I do, I have to decide between 4 different ways to get to work. And I'm judging constantly. I say, should I take this one, that one, or that one when I get to a particular intersection? Making that judgment is an executive function. It's amazing. No other animal can do that. Humans 250,000 years ago couldn't do that. It's incredible that we can do things like that. Picking stocks, hiring employees, deciding which class to take. That's executive function, and it's a miracle. But your brain does something else with the same circuitry, with the medial prefrontal cortex, and it's called moral judgment. That's when you decide not whether one decision or the other is the best decision, it's whether one decision or the other is the right decision morally. Okay, now, it may seem like that's a lesser function, but it turns out it's a more important function. It happens faster, it actually happens more powerfully, and it can occupy the medial prefrontal cortex to the exclusion of everything else. What brain scientists are showing us is that if you have a moral decision that you have to confront at the same time as a series of executive or rational decisions, the moral decision will crowd everything else out and you can't concentrate on anything. I have a friend who has a new book out that demonstrates this, and I'm going to prove it to you right now. I'm going to show you something about your own brains right now. And I'm going to tell you a story. And if you don't remember anything about this whole lecture, in a year, you're going to remember this story. Because I'm going to occupy your medial prefrontal cortices in a powerful way. So I have this friend, his name is Jonathan Haidt. He's a social psychology professor at the University of Virginia. He wrote a book called The Righteous Mind. It's a big bestseller right now. It debuted last week at number 6 on the New York Times bestseller list. I read it in manuscript, but I've been talking to him and hanging out with him and working together with him on various projects for a long time. He is the world's leading expert on moral judgment. And he brings groups of people like this into an auditorium and shows them that their moral mind is more powerful than their rational mind by blowing out their medial prefrontal cortex with a moral judgment. And he does it with a series of stories. So I'm going to tell you one of his stories. There's a family, maybe like mine. I have 3 young kids. Mom, dad, 3 young kids. And this family's at war. This family's constantly fighting. They're fighting over whether or not they should get a dog. It's a pretty common problem in families, right? And actually, we've gone through it in my family, where the kids wanted a dog and mom and dad said no. Mom, can we get a dog? You know who's going to end up taking care of it? It's us. No, right? Mom, can we get a dog? It goes on and on and on. You know who always wins, right? And the way it works is the kids win over mom, and there's a coalition against dad, and then dad caves in, right? It's the way it always works, every family. And that's the way it happens in this family. Dad says, fine. We go down to the pound. Dad's in a bad mood. They're looking at the puppies. Yeah, they're cute, right? They pick one out. They name her Muffin, and they bring her home. Now, it turns out mom and dad were wrong, completely wrong. Muffin's great. You know who loves Muffin the most? Dad does. Dad comes running home from work because he wants to walk Muffin because it's like the only relaxing thing he's got in his whole life, right? The only being in the whole family who likes him is Muffin, right? So the guys are all laughing, right? It's like, you can relate to that. So it turns out that this is the thing that's brought the family together the most, sort of in the history of this family. They're really glad they got Muffin. A couple years go by, and one summer day, it's August, it's a beautiful day, warm afternoon. The youngest child, who's 8, just like my daughter, she accidentally leaves the front door open. Muffin sees a squirrel in the front yard, right? Goes running out the front door after the squirrel, crosses the street, boom, hit by a car, killed in front of the whole family, right? Kids are screaming, mom's crying, dad's crying. It's terrible, right? Kids say, what do we do? What do we do? Dad picks up Muffin's lifeless body, still warm, brings her into the house, and together as a family, they decide to cook her and eat her. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Jonathan Haidt, my friend, he told me that story, and I said, you got tenure doing that? That's the problem with the American university system in a nutshell, right? Yeah. You're not going to forget that. And the reason you're not going to forget that is because you were tracking that story using executive function and irrational function in your medial prefrontal cortex, and I suddenly blew all your circuits out with a moral judgment. You weren't waiting for that. And suddenly, you couldn't process anything else because that was so weird. It was so horrible, right? Now, when John Haidt asks his audience, is that the right thing to do? They go, no. He says, how come? They go, I don't know, right? I don't. It says, give me an explanation. And they can't come up with anything for minutes, half an hour goes by. And they're coming up with these explanations that are nothing more than a restatement of their initial moral judgment. Things like, well, the nature of loving relationships precludes the eating of one's pets, right? Completely lame. That's basically just saying it's immoral to eat your dog, right? When people are confronted with this big moral thing that confronts lots and lots of moral issues in our lives all at once, we can't concentrate on anything else. That's the bottom line. And what this tells us is this. When you're in an argument, when you're trying to convince somebody of something, you get 5 seconds. You get 5 seconds to win, or you got 5 seconds to lose. And if you don't start your argument with your best moral claim, you lose, unless your opponent is worse than you. Okay, so every conservative I've ever met has been in the following situation. Thanksgiving dinner. So my family, I grew up in a family of liberals in Seattle, Washington. My dad was a college professor at a little liberal arts college, and my parents were pretty liberal. And as a matter of fact, at one point when I was 28 years old, and my parents were starting to figure out something was wrong with me politically, I was back at Christmas, and I was in the kitchen. I was cooking dinner with my mom, and she got real quiet. We were alone, and she was real quiet. And I said, "Oh man, something's up." She said, "Arthur, I have to ask you a personal question," which is always really bad. Always really bad. She said, "I want you to be honest with me, completely straight with me. Have you been voting for Republicans?" So you've all conservatives have been in the situation, particularly when they're a family like mine. They're the only conservative at the Thanksgiving table, right? And everybody turns to you. Whenever there's anything about politics, you have to represent that side. And it's kind of a pain. It's like, can I eat the turkey? Leave me alone, right? No, you got to do it. And so it'll be something like, what about all that crony capitalism? You like that? Free enterprise nut? You like that stuff? Right? You say, no, it's not like that. You don't understand that entrepreneurship is the only way we can bring the economy back. As a matter of fact, our corporate tax rate is the second highest in the OECD countries, and only by being competitive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Airtight, right? All facts. And your sister-in-law, really liberal, she sits across the table from me and she says, the other day I met a little girl and she lives with her mother in a car. Why don't you want the government to help her, right? And you lost. You lost. It's over, You throw in the towel. I mean, the whole thing is done. And the reason is not because people are stupid. The reason is not even that her argument is right. She may or may not know the kid. And it's an anecdote, and your data might be watertight, but she made a moral argument, and she won the medial prefrontal cortices of all the people sitting around the table, and you didn't. That's what conservatives are doing. And that's why conservatives are losing. And that's what they have to do differently going forward. Okay, so where am I pointing this? I'm pointing this here, okay. What is the moral basis that we need to make? What is the moral basis of the free enterprise system? The way to start to answer this question is not by trying to just make it up. Let's go back to the founders. You know the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence by heart, that we are endowed by our Creator with several unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is a profound moral claim. That is not a materialistic claim. That's a moral promise from the founders to you, basically. Now, you can mock it or deride it, but it was the moral basis of the founding of the country. What is the pursuit of happiness? What did they mean by that, and how do we interpret that today? Is it the possession of property? I know it's not the possession of property. I know it's not a materialistic thing. How do I know? I know because of the historical evidence. The Declaration of Independence was not an entirely original document. It was based on a document called the Virginia Declaration of Rights that was submitted 3 weeks earlier by George Mason. Now, I know we've got some historians in here, so forgive me. We're going to go quickly over this, and in the question and answer, you can tell me all the ways I'm wrong. George Mason submitted a document that made the promises to the people that emphasized life, liberty, and the possession of property. Something happened in the intervening 3 weeks where the possession of property was no longer emphasized, and the pursuit of happiness was. Now, there are lots of stories about this. One story that you frequently hear, and it's unverifiable at this point, as far as I'm concerned, I looked and looked and looked and looked, is that Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin decided that the possession of property was insufficiently moral to justify struggle for the greatest experiment in liberty in the history of the world. Now, recall, the idea of American liberty was a theory. The idea was going to be a great and prosperous country. Pure theory at that point. We got lots of data on it now. Look, everybody, all of us know it's a great country. Everybody knows there's a lot of liberty and it's really nice to live here. But nobody had the data back there. And the idea was, according to this story, maybe apocryphal, that Thomas Jefferson decided that he needed more morally loaded language to present to the American people such that they could struggle, perhaps die for the new country. So the question is, what is the pursuit of happiness? We know it's not the pursuit of money. As a matter of fact, I wrote a whole book on the subject of money and happiness. It was the last big project I did when I was here at the Maxwell School. I consider it the best piece of research I have ever done. Readers disagreed. It sold 8 copies on Amazon. My own brother gave it 1 star, right? But one of the things that you find is that just as your mother taught you and just as your rabbi told you and everything else, money doesn't buy happiness. Money is uncorrelated with happiness when you factor out all of the other reasonable explanations for what's going on. And there's a related literature that is pretty interesting as a result of this. And that's the literature on the happiness or unhappiness of men. Okay? Now, there's a very distinct point in men's lives where they are unhappiest. What do you think is the unhappiest average age in a man's life? Now, women don't have this, and if you want later we can talk about why women don't have this. Men do. It's very clear in the data, and I've run the data analysis myself. I've replicated the studies that are in the economics literature about this and the psych literature about this. There's an identifiable age. What's the unhappiest average age in a man's life? 45. Well done. It is 45. 45 is the average unhappiest age in a man's life. How come? So I go to one of my friends who's a psychologist. I say, how come? What does the literature say is going on in men's lives when they're 45? Look, the midlife crisis, it's a total cliche. I mean, everybody's heard about this thing. So what's going on in the psych literature? And the answer is basically one of 2 things that psychologists tell you. Number one, and I'll just, we'll give you the data, I'll just summarize. Number one is that's when your wife figures out definitively that you're boring, right? That's explanation number one. Explanation number 2 is you have a teenager at home, right? Misery. I have one. So those 2 things together are the standard psychological explanations. But there's an economics explanation for why 45 is the worst age for men. And it has to do with money. And it goes something like this, because you can actually see this in the data as well. When men are in their 20s, when they're starting their careers, they follow the big superhighway with the neon lights. It's called money. They follow this highway and they're cruising down it. And somewhere around age 45, they figured out that they missed an exit, a poorly marked exit in their lives. They missed what they really wanted. I know, Washington, D.C. is full of lawyers. It's a terrible place for that. Sorry, Lisa. It's much better here. So, and you talk to a lot of them, and they're really miserable. And you say, what's your problem? You chose to be a lawyer. You're making $1 million a year. What's the deal? They say, I hate being a lawyer. I wanted to do something else. I wanted to be a scholar, or I wanted to be a poet, or something, right? I wanted to be a carpenter, make cabinetry, or something, right? Write songs. Right? But I can't do anything about it now because my mortgage is like $10,000 a month, and my kids are in private school, and my wife would divorce me, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're stuck. They're handcuffed, bottom line. They missed the exit. So here's my question then. Let's go back to the literature. What's on the exit that they missed? What is it that we really crave? If it's not money, what is the pursuit of happiness? How do we summarize it? How do we measure it? And the answer is something that at AEI and in my work and the work of a number of other people, we call earned success. Earned success is the belief that you are creating value with your life and value in the lives of other people. It might be related to money, but it might not be. When you ask people if they believe they've earned their success, social entrepreneurs, this is something I've taught here at SU, social entrepreneurship, something I've studied a lot. I wrote a textbook on it one time that I don't recommend to you. Social entrepreneurs are every bit as happy as commercial entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs are the happiest professionals in America. The happiest profession are people who say that they are entrepreneurs. They're not richest, on the contrary. The average entrepreneur in America makes 19% less money per year than the average government manager. The truth is, entrepreneurship is inherently rewarding per se. Ask them why. They will talk about earned success, creating value with their lives and value in the lives of other people. If you take two people who are exactly the same, these are data from the General Social Survey collected by the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago. Two people are exactly the same. Same age, same race, same religion, same region of origin, same level of education. And they both say that they have earned their success, but one earns 8 times as much money. They will be equally likely to say that they are happy about their lives. And this has been stable for year after year after year. Now, this is pretty important stuff, because if you miss the exit, little letters, earned success, that means you have to define your destiny, and then you have to chase it. You will be in the tyranny of materialism. That's a guarantee. And that's the male midlife crisis in a nutshell. Of course, discovered by an economist. What would you expect? Now, so we want to talk about earned success. This stuff is real, and I can go into more detail if you want, but I need to go on to another couple topics. What else do we talk about in the moral case for free enterprise? And I want to go back to my friend John Haidt in his work, because he's done a lot of data analysis figuring out what people think constitutes a moral government and a moral system. Done a lot of work on this. And what are the characteristics of a moral system? He has found that conservatives and centrists and liberals agree that a moral system is one that's fair to everybody and does not hurt the poor. Everybody agrees on that. Now, everybody agrees on that in surveys in which you don't have to give the politically correct answer. This is something that everybody thinks is simply the right kind of system. So this is non-political, right? Now, that means that we need to be able to make the case as conservatives for fairness and doing the kinds of activities and public policies that lift people up. So how do we do that? The first is fairness. This is really, really tough. You know, you can't turn on TV without the President of the United States talking about the fact that the Republicans want policies that are unfair to the poor. And the free enterprise system is too unfair. And the capitalist economy is too unfair. We have a fairness crisis in this country. We hear it again and again and again. What should conservatives say? Well, we got a problem. We got a problem. Who is St. Milton? Anybody know who St. Milton is? Milton Friedman. Well done. Milton Friedman. You know, you got to love him. Nobody did more important pioneering work on the culture of freedom in this country. But when it came to fairness, he had it all wrong. Here's what he said. Fairness is too hard to define. It's too subjective, so stay away from the subject. That's wrong. Why is that wrong? Look, Milton Friedman was a genius, and I'm not. But let me tell you, I've got lots of human emotions. And I know that fairness matters. I know it matters. And I've seen the data. It matters to you too, and it matters to every single person in this country. That's like basically saying, I can't really tell you what it means to fall in love, so let's disregard the whole idea. There's no life in life anymore. Nobody believes that. Everybody knows that's wrong. Fairness matters. So what do? What do conservatives do about this? The first is to stop losing the fight over fairness by not showing up. Every time there's a fight over fairness, conservatives go running in the other direction. Let me tell you, that's true in Washington, D.C. So what should they do instead? Here's the to-do list. Number one, define fairness as fairness occurs to you. And I can tell you that 70% of Americans, including virtually every single conservative in this country, when you ask them to define fairness, they don't say anything about redistributing income. Nothing. They talk about rewarding merit, rewarding hard work, and creating individual opportunity. That's a truly fair society. Now, we can get into lots of arguments about how you do those types of things, but that's how virtually every conservative in this country defines fairness, and a big majority of Americans as well. The reason conservatives are losing the fairness argument is because they never show up. They need to show up, define it on their terms, define unfairness, and taking from earners, taking from makers in the society, define current policies as fundamentally unfair, and demand a true fairness-based economy. This wins. I know it wins, because I've seen it win. But it only wins if there's a lot of courage, and conservatives are willing to start making this argument. Now, you can combat it on its merits. I'm sure you will. But this is the one thing that when I talk to politicians, I say, when I'm talking to liberal politicians, I say, be ready to deal with this. When I'm talking to conservative politicians, I say, do this, because it really works. Okay, now the poor. Every conservative, once again, has heard, you just don't care about poor people. You hate poor people. What's wrong with you? Why do you hate the poor? Right? And conservatives hem and haw, and they stutter about it, and they say something about economic efficiency. I don't hate the poor, but the foundation of our nation was on the basis of an enterprising culture or something like that, trying to change the subject, basically. There's no reason to change the subject. Everybody in this country cares about helping the poor. Everybody knows. If you know one thing, you know it's not moral to hurt poor people. If you don't know that, you were raised by wolves, basically. Everybody knows that you must care about the least among us. And so what should conservatives talk about? And the answer is what free enterprise has done for the poor. Let me give you an example. You may or may not know that since 1970, the worst world poverty, which is to say the number of people living on $1 a day or less, and obviously corrected for inflation, the number of people living on $1 a day or less has declined by 80% since 1970. What an unbelievable victory. Most people don't know that. It's incredible. And you know why that is? Anybody know why that is? Is it because of the UN? Is it because of the International Monetary Fund? Is it because of international treaties or foreign aid? Those things might be good, but they're not a system. The only way you can lift up people by the billions is with a system. And that system, conservatives can and should argue, is the free enterprise system that brings global trade, that brings innovation, that brings free enterprise, that brings entrepreneurship around the world. Now, I just got back from China because AEI is setting up a China program. Fantastically interesting. And when you talk to entrepreneurs and government officials alike, they will note to you that 75% of world poverty, 75% of world poverty reductions since 1980 have been in that single country. Since 1980, 600 million Chinese have been lifted out of poverty. Why? Everybody in China, government officials from the standing committee of the Politburo all the way through to the most Jeffersonian type free enterprise nuts, or they will tell you it's because of trade. They'll tell you it's because of world trade. Trade with the United States since 1980 has increased by 1,000%. The bottom line is millions and millions of people have been lifted out of poverty because of the stuff you buy, is what it comes down to. Now, I'm not going to argue to you that there's nothing wrong with trade and there's nothing wrong with the agreements that we make and that doesn't have side effects. But these things are facts. And that conservatives better start getting used to making these arguments, because if they don't, they're leaving very powerful arguments on the table about the poor, and they're going to lose. Okay, now, let's get back to conservatives and liberals and morality and talk about what they don't agree on. Because we know three things that conservatives and liberals about morality don't agree on. And they are, in order, loyalty to country or clan, respect for authority, and sexual purity. Now, lots of liberals and conservatives care about these issues. But what the data from John Haidt's work shows is that you don't light up the medial prefrontal cortex of liberals when you talk about these things. They might have really super strong views on these things, but only conservatives have kind of an inborn moral sense about these things. In other words, and it's interesting, I was talking to a group of Congresswoman Buerkel's colleagues the other day on the Hill, and I said, what do you think when I say flag burning? And one of them said, treason, immediately, right? Now, when you say that to a lot of liberals or people who have a lot of liberal sensibilities like I do, you say, what do you think about flag burning? I say, it's kind of unwise, you might get beat up, right? It's different is the bottom line. Now, I might have a strong view it's the wrong thing to do, but it's not the same moral sense. Respect for authority, the idea of cursing at a military officer, and that's one of the experiments that John Haidt has gone through. Sexual purity. When you talk about sexual purity issues, liberals might say, there's all sorts of ways that you should behave, but only conservatives are the ones who say inherently immoral all the time from the very beginning. This is a big difference. Now, that literature is super interesting, and I recommend your interest in an article in Science magazine from the year 2004, written by John Haidt, that actually outlines exactly how these things work, but it has tons of public policy relevance. What it basically says is that when conservatives appeal to the natural morality of Americans on these dimensions, they lose 60% of the population. And let me give you a little case study. We've all been arguing about the HHS mandate, the mandate that all employers have to pay for contraceptive services for Americans. Now, when that got into the hands of Rick Santorum, he said, it's not right that we should have to pay for contraceptives and subsidize the sex lives of Americans, right? As soon as he said that, you might agree, you might be liberal, you might be conservative, you might agree, right? As soon as he said that, he lost 60% of the population. Why? Because he assumed that all reasonable people agreed with him morally. That was the wrong way to go. The only argument that's really compelling to a large group of Americans, about 70% of Americans, is to talk about religious freedom and to talk about the fact that this law actually puts the vulnerable at risk to the extent that it will require that people pay for abortion providing drugs. Those are the arguments that work, according to the data. Okay? So this actually explains a lot about why conservatives from birth, conservatives from conservative families, don't understand the rest of America, because they're assuming that everybody has these moral sensibilities just like they do. You might agree with them, but not for the same reasons. Okay, so here are the three arguments that conservatives have to make and introduce in the first 5 seconds of every debate. Earned success, fairness, and lifting up the poor. You have to establish your bona fides on one or more of these three moral dimensions. Conservatives hate doing it. You say, I got all the data. Why do I have to say that, well, these policies, the problem with President Obama's policies, they're not fair? Why do you have to do it? Because you want to win. And you're not going to win unless you make the moral case. And I got the data to show it. These are the three arguments that conservatives need to make if there's going to be a future of American conservatism. The structure of a winning economic argument. State your case in terms of earned success, fairness, and lifting up the poor. Only then show your data and propose new policies. The long-term strategy to resolve the paradox of government growth, conservatives don't like it, and conservatives shouldn't like it, is to make the moral case to conservative voters themselves. Appeal to them in a moral way. And that's what the Tea Party movement, the reason it's so powerful, is that's what it does. It's an ethical populist movement. It says, it's not right for us to be stealing from our children. It's not right to get in front of the way of entrepreneurs. It's not right. It's not fair. They say things like, why did your ancestors come here? Was it to get a fairer system of forced income redistribution? No. It was to get a fair shot. It was the whole idea. And that's the evocative moral language, the only thing that will turn people away from free stuff. And back to the ideas of the founders, even though it's not necessarily in their short-term economic interest. Only then will they sacrifice. So here's my conclusions, then I'm going to turn it over to my friends. Conservatives not going to win the White House in 2012 unless he I say he at this point because I think we can decide that pretty conclusively. I don't think anybody's going to jump in at the level of the convention. A conservative won't win in 2012 without a reliance on the morality of free enterprise, without a reliance on the moral case for free enterprise. The economic trends towards social democracy are going to continue. We're going to hit a tipping point. We're going to be just like Europe, unless conservatives start to talk to their base in these terms as well. And American conservatism will actually not have a future under those circumstances. Thank you.
Thanks, Arthur. It's a little bit difficult to know where to begin, but I'll try. And what I want to do is just make a few points that don't try to make the moral case for liberals, which it would be interesting to try to do, but to take on some of your claims and arguments about how conservatives believe or should believe. To begin with, since I'm an academic, what we do usually is define terms, which you didn't do much of. So free enterprise, for example, just to begin with, I could infer some definitions from your talk, but you didn't really provide one. The three arguments, I assume, are kind of what free enterprise, the earned success and fairness and maybe lifting up the poor. But let's stick with earned success and fairness to begin with as reasonable definitions for, or components, if you will, of a free enterprise system. So put those on one side. It seems to me that we could perhaps all agree with that. As you said, most Americans agree that the free enterprise system, however that's defined, and I doubt that the public opinion polls define that, is a good thing, right? But what you've done, it seems to me, is made free enterprise implicitly in a zero-sum relationship to a large government or even a social democratic government. And I disagree with that. I don't think that's necessarily correct. And in fact, the Cato Institute, another conservative think tank, has some indicators of the extent to which countries, I think, protect free enterprise, or the free enterprise flourishes in countries. So they looked at the legal structure, the extent to which property rights were protected, access to ability to borrow money, freedom to trade internationally, and the U.S. ranks lower on that than, say, the Netherlands and Denmark. So in other words, here are these social democracies in Europe that do spend a lot of money, do provide a lot of services, do provide a big safety net, and yet in the way the Cato Institute is looking at this, they are more protective of or nourishing of free enterprise. And it seems to me then that free enterprise and this fairness and earned success really depends on equal opportunity. That's a phrase that you didn't mention at all. But it seems to me that if we have a system that's, let's call it free enterprise, that is characterized by earned success and fairness, that people have to have there has to be a level playing field. And let's look at two areas where we really, really don't have an equal playing field. The most important of those is education. And it's just untenable to think, or I think none of us would agree, that we have an education system in this country which gets people to a certain level where they can compete, where they can earn success, where they can be a social entrepreneur, or where they can be a commercial entrepreneur realistically. Yes, some people break out of disadvantaged situations, but more people don't. And the proof of this, I think, is in the very depressing data that we've seen recently on intergenerational social mobility. In other words, the best measure, perhaps, of whether a country has equal opportunity is the extent to which you're locked in. People are locked into the class positions in which they grew up. And if you look at the kind of correlation between people's income and their father's income, the United States looks terrible right now. We do not have intergenerational mobility. We have intergenerational immobility. in a way that has increased over time and in a way that we look different from these social democracies, which have a lot more intergenerational social mobility. Just briefly, I'd make a second point, which was made by the government's lawyer arguing in front of the Supreme Court, I think yesterday, or no, I guess it was Wednesday. And he tried to make an argument at the end of his time about better access and equal access, which we also don't have, to health care being a necessary thing for full pursuit, not of happiness, but of liberty, which I thought was a really interesting argument. He was basically saying that if people don't have access to just reasonable health care, have difficulty maintaining their health, they can't fully participate as members of a democracy. They can't fully participate as a healthy citizen. So I'd focus on education mostly in making this critique that we don't have a level playing field. We don't have a system where people can earn their success, and we don't have a fair system, but I'd also point to the healthcare system. Second general point, I guess I disagree with your 5-second rule. I think that the notion of a moral argument is an interesting one. I'm familiar with your friend's work. The importance of moral judgment, I think, pursuing this 5-second rule and saying you've got to catch people right away, you've got to make this one claim and get them, I'm a little skeptical about that because I think that that's too close to the kind of lies and misrepresentations I think we see a lot in the media, or the focus on sound bites and the focus on sort of everybody has their own facts in contradistinction to Daniel Patrick Moynihan's notion that we can have opinions, but we can't have our own facts. So, but in any case, I think the notion of needing to make a moral argument does not mean that we have to abandon the focus on making more extensive, reasonable, complicated arguments and trying to appeal to people's reasons. And I don't think you're really saying that either. I hope not, anyway. So I guess the kind of complicated arguments I would like to see us making are, even if we can agree on the importance of the three things, the fairness, the earned success, and lifting up the poor, the question should be, how do we get to this from where we actually are? And it seems to me that's a very long, complicated journey, given where we actually are right now, given the inequalities in this society. I don't think it means that we get government out of the way, and I think we can see by some of the social democracies that perhaps there are models there. But I think that we need to educate people about what fairness really looks like, how we can move toward it. And this is amenable, it seems to me, to discussion and compromise, not war or 5-second moral arguments. So that's all I'll say. I have lots more to say.
Well, I certainly share Arthur's diagnosis of the problem, and I also fully agree with his prescription for what conservatism needs, and I think for what the country needs. I agree that that prescription should have great potency. In other words, I agree that there is a moral case to be made for conservatism and by conservatives. Arthur stressed things like the potency of the value of self-reliance and the power of discovering that earned success truly is its own reward. I would venture a guess that many of you have seen that in your own lives and in the lives of your children. I know I have, and these principles really do lie at the core of my personal political philosophy. I came prepared. I was somewhat taken aback, though. I came prepared to hear a more optimistic talk by Arthur, and so at this point I was going to mention that I don't share his optimism, but he came right out and said he's not terribly bullish, and I'm right with him. And I don't want to repeat, but I guess what I'm going to do is pile on with a little more bad news for conservatism. He alluded to, we certainly all know the data regarding increasing dependence on government and the change over time. We have a public that decries the size of government, but members of the public who cling to their government benefits and subsidies, including the famous statistic of Tea Partiers who railed against government-provided health care while opposing any significant cuts to their own Medicare, which is government-provided health care, by a 2-to-1 margin. The reality is that government officials of both major parties get elected by promising increasing government benefits. That we don't have any serious discussions in this country about deficit reduction. We're certainly not talking about it in the Republican primaries, and we can be sure we won't be talking about it in the run-up to the general election. In fact, we never have serious conversations about it, except in the heated context of debt ceiling showdowns or tax cut expiration deadlines. When it does come to cuts, the one area that people mention the most that they'd like to see cut is military and defense spending. That should be good news for conservatives, except that our modern conservative leaders are completely enamored with and tethered for their very survival to, politically speaking, military and defense spending. Woe to the Republican candidate who dares to mention cutting defense. And this has to do, by the way, with Arthur talked about the moral judgments crowding out the executive judgments. I think this attachment we have to military and defense power in this country has a lot to do with the ego crowding out the moral. Speaking of litmus tests, the future of conservatism is bleak unless the movement can embrace a tenet of the past and reject extremes of party loyalty. Those who dare not toe the line don't live, politically speaking, in this day and age to tell about it. Instead, we have conservatives, so-called conservatives, who want more government in our lives, and subjects like gay marriage and interfering with the patient-physician relationship. Conservatives who embrace wanton expenditure of resources and lives through unjustifiable interventions in other countries. There is nothing conservative about that. And conservatives, so-called, who reject or ignore fundamental freedoms, First Amendment freedoms, things like issues about flag burning. But my final evidence that I'd cite in terms of the future of conservatism not being terribly bright is just demographics. The traditional base of the Republican Party is in decline as a portion of the population. And it is fair to talk about the Republican Party in this regard because as a practical matter, that's where conservatives have to go in terms of airing their views. Socioeconomic trends favor Democrats and liberals, and the Republican Party has accelerated the decline of conservatism through just, for example, some of its extreme anti-science and anti-immigrant stances. So I'm not optimistic. Conservatism has lost its way. Conservatives have given conservatism a bad name. Arthur says the moral judgment may well crowd out the executive, but self-interest in this country has crowded out morality. Americans like free stuff, and that is why I'm not optimistic. I hope Arthur will persuade me that I'm wrong, however. Thank you.
We've got about 20, 25 minutes or so for questions. I imagine that you've stimulated a few. So what I might ask is if you want to just give the very briefest of responses, maybe just a minute or so, and then we'll jump right into them. And for the folks that want to ask a question, I would ask you to wait for the microphone to come to you, in part because that is the only way that we'll be able to get you into the broadcast. Do you want to just make a couple quick responses?
Well, what I'll say is I'm going to cede my time to the audience, and I'm just going to, if anybody wants to ask about the two central assertions, one is how do we get toward a society of equal opportunity from Christy, and whether or not we should be quite that pessimistic from Lisa. I'd be delighted because I'm not as pessimistic as Lisa. And I do believe that we can achieve equality of opportunity, particularly more through the education system. But I'm going to cede my time to the audience because I want to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, my belief is that the history of the United States actually has roughly followed your outline. It is my belief the existence of Stephen Jobs could not have happened in any other country except the United States and that's based on the rule of law that we have in this country, and that when he gained success, he wasn't trampled down by commercial interests that happens in other countries. In Europe and Italy and other places, I know people in Italy, they say doing business is atrocious with government regulations and compete, and the prime minister himself there was stomping out any people. So that's what do you think about my point? Stephen Jobs could only have arisen in the United States.
So far, this is the most congenial environment to the flourishing of Steve Jobs. I think that's a relatively uncontroversial statement. I will say that we're not going in the right direction for the continued flourishing of Steve Jobs. I will say that there are other countries around the world that are on the right track to create an environment that will let Steve Jobs flourish. But I also will tell you that when you go to China, they all want the American system, and that's the reason I'm more optimistic. That people all around the world still want our system because they still believe it is the best system for creating that sort of flourishing.
So I have to say that I thought that I would kind of hate you because, of course, who likes a conservative? Well, anyway, but I believe that there is a contradiction in the moral arguments that you're presenting, specifically between the notion of fairness, the way you describe it, and lifting of the poor. Because in the notion of fairness, one of the arguments you made is that it's not fair to take other people's income to pass it to somebody else. But at the same time, lifting of the poor requires us to do that because the assumption that you're making is that everybody is able to have earned success, and that is not the case. I mean, think about the thousands of soldiers that are coming back from Vietnam who will be handicapped and unable to work. Think about the people in the inner city that do not have access to the same level of educational opportunities that people in wealthier neighborhoods had, and think about mental illness. So the fact that everybody's able for earned success implies that to lift up the poor, we need to be able to pass from some individuals to others.
Mm-hmm. These are very good points, and I want to emphasize a couple of quick things. One is you've touched on Christie's argument about education, for example. Another point that you make is that the existence of a safety net actually can get people to a minimum basic standard of living such that they can have the kind of opportunity that can lead to a society more of earned success. This is true. One of the things that conservatives need to come to complete terms with is the fact that American conservatism, or any kind of conservatism, or libertarianism, is not hostile to the concept of a minimum basic safety net. That's, as a matter of fact, let's go to probably the most important economist of the 20th century in libertarian thinking, which is Friedrich Hayek. Friedrich Hayek said the government has two functions. Number one is to sort out market failures. Number two is to provide a minimum basic safety net. But what did he say the safety net was? The safety net is minimal, and it's not to sort out discrepancies in income so that people are equal. It's not to get rid of risk in people's lives, and it's not to create welfare for middle-class people. That's not a safety net. The minimum basic safety net in a civilized society is one where people in a social contract decide what's the minimum basic levels of medicine and food and housing. That's the kind of conversation we should be having instead of a conversation, in my view. It's not a conversation that we're having when we're talking about the Social Security system continuing to provide welfare for middle-class people, the Medicare system to provide medical care for middle-class people, the Medicare Part D benefit that gives free prescription drugs to middle-class people. The average middle-class person retires and takes 3 times more into the Social Security system than he or she pays in. That's not what Hayek had in mind. That's not the safety net. There's nothing wrong with a safety net, but we don't have anything close to being like a safety net. Number one, education. Number two, it's true. We have a civil rights disaster in this country because we don't have equal access to good education for young people. So what do we need? Okay, so you're conservative like me. You say, let's have an education system in this country that's built for kids, not for grown-ups. That's the problem as conservatives see it. We have education systems that are built for bureaucrats and teachers unions as opposed to inducing the kind of innovation that would be kid-focused. That's what drives conservatives crazy. Now, look, I didn't mean to set the whole place on fire, and I know a lot of you know a whole lot about education, but that's how conservatives see it, and it's absolutely true. No conservative should argue that the education system is bringing us to an equal opportunity society, because it isn't, and the reason it isn't is because we're not actually trying to serve the equal civil rights of children in this country. Yeah, that's right.
Well,
I'm sure
all I'd say to that is that I think there are a lot of people trying new experiments in education. Some of them would classify themselves as liberals, some of them would classify themselves as conservatives, but that's another area in which I think it shouldn't be looked at as conservative and liberal. Right. I think it's an area that we all have to work together, not making moral arguments that the other people are immoral, to solve the problems of our education system.
I agree with that.
Isn't the problem, this has been, I think, very well defined, the basic problem we face. I think in this country we like to think of ourselves as conservatives, yet we like to live in a social democracy. In a sense, we enjoy our hypocrisy. We want to be against socialist security, but we want our check or our funds transfer or whatever it is twice a month. Even Ayn Rand was collecting Social Security and Medicare when she passed away. You're also, I think you're missing the middle range here, like that famous cartoon by S. Harris, where a miracle has to occur in step 2. How do you get from people being dependent on government and enjoying that hypocrisy to something where they can be more independent without being impoverished or homeless or without health care or all the rest of it?
Yeah, great question. How do you do it? It's all about execution, isn't it? Let's look at a quick case study on where it worked. There are very few case studies in which the ideology of free enterprise actually wins, but there's one, and it's welfare reform. Okay, now, when I was a kid growing up in Seattle, there were a lot of poor people in my neighborhood. We were under extremely austere economic circumstances, and a lot of people around us were poorer, and a lot of people were on welfare. Now, one of the things that everybody knew, was that welfare was bad for poor people when I was a kid, right? Everybody knew that. Now, it didn't mean you should get rid of it. It just meant that the way it was currently constructed was bad for poor people. My dad, who was not a conservative, told us this is not good for them. This is not good. It's creating dependency. It's bad for the poor. Again, if you know one thing morally, don't hurt poor people. Okay, but nothing ever happened. Why? Because conservatives always made the argument that the problem with the welfare system is it's a colossal waste of money. That didn't carry the day because it was a materialistic argument. What was the miracle? The miracle occurred in 1984 when there was a book that was written called Losing Ground by Charles Murray. That was my colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, who said, the problem with the welfare system is not that it wastes a ton of money, which it does. The problem with the welfare system is that it hurts the people it's supposed to help. That cut the moral umbilical cord. That cut the legitimacy morally of the current system as it was configured. Now, it took a long time to fix it until Bill Clinton had the courage to sign that legislation into law in 1996. It took 12 years. But every big thing takes at least a decade. If you look at the data, every major inflection in public policy takes a decade. So this is one of the things that I tell political conservatives who in Congress. If you think we're going to turn this thing around in this country in 1 year, in 2012 in the election, you're wrong. If you're not ready to fight for what you think is right for a decade, you're going to lose, because it takes a decade. Look, all of the bad predations come back, and they come back, and they come back. It takes 10 years of fighting. That's what happened with welfare reform. How was welfare reform won? Not by the materialistic argument. Welfare reform was fundamentally won by the moral argument. That's the only way it works. And that's the way we're going to have to work on it this way, too. Thank you.
I would like to ask a question about a very the broadest level you refer to, which is this difference between social democracies in Europe and the American system. And to me, I always perceived America and Europe pretty much, with all their differences, belonging to the same ball game in a way. We're just talking about capitalist society, capitalist systems that may be located on different parts of this continuum, but nonetheless a continuum, which kind of embraces these two different kinds of societies. But when you referred to the founding fathers, to the founding principles and precepts of American democracy and American system, you kind of drew a line between social democracies and America. So what I'm asking you here, and probably it goes back a little bit to what Professor Anderson was talking about, do you really see a fundamental incompatibility between social democracy and what is to be America, what it means? And yeah, that would be my question for you. Thank you.
Great question. And Christy doesn't think there's an incompatibility. She told us she doesn't see an incompatibility between social democratic elements and free enterprise elements in our economy, that they're not at war. They're not hostile toward each other. And part of it is because these safety net things, that even beyond the safety net things, if I can tell me if I'm getting this wrong, can lead people to a more of an opportunity society such that the free enterprise system can authentically work under these circumstances. Now, the truth of the matter is that European-style social democracies, or I should say European social democracies, have a different social contract than we have here in the United States. Every country is different. You know, when I talk to Swedes, they say, here's the way America should work. I resent that. But I also don't have permission to go to the Swedes and say, your system should be different. Every country gets to decide. In fact, there's always going to be a tension between redistribution and social democracy and free markets and efficiency. There's always going to be a tension. We're trying to find the balance. Hayek said the balance needs to include an appropriate social safety net. He says, and that's above zero, is what he said. Already we're somewhere on the continuum. Absolutely. We're just trying to adjudicate that. The problem that I showed you before, is that we've been moving all the way up, and we've even passed Europe in most dimensions. We have a more progressive tax code than Europe. We have a higher corporate tax rate. We have a larger percentage that don't pay any taxes. We have a larger number of people that are completely on government benefits. We have a larger percentage of GDP that's run through the government than many of the Western European social democracies. And at some point, we're going to hit a tipping point. At some point, the free enterprise system will have been pushed too far. And at that point, there's no going back. That's what actually I'm urging that we think about. That's what I'm urging that conservatives think about, and they combat by making these moral arguments. But you're completely right. We're actually just simply trying to find our balance. And I think that we have been off balance for a very, very long time.
You said that you didn't want to touch on social or national security issues, but I just wanted to kind of follow up on something that was in the responses. Do you think that conservatives can't really make a strong moral argument for free enterprise because the modern conservative, the modern Republican often is for more government intervention in social issues and national security issues, and there's kind of some hypocrisy there?
I don't see hypocrisy. I think that there's a lot of nuance to the way that a traditional conservative understands how freedom is supposed to be executed here and around the world. Lisa's more libertarian than I am in her thinking, I think it's fair to say. You quite kindly didn't bring up an op-ed I had in the Wall Street Journal 2 days ago defending the defense budget. I thought that was really nice of you, and I appreciate that. Of course, I just brought it up, so I think that conservatives have to figure out where they think that the defense of a particular system, where it should stop. You know, and there are a few things to keep in mind. You know, one of the reasons that 600 million people have been pulled out of poverty in China is because of a global trading system. And the reason there's a global trading system is because of open sea lanes. And the reason there are open sea lanes is because of American military power. American military power, sometimes hostile to Chinese interests, has made the Chinese richer. It's really complicated stuff. Does that mean we should do it? No. It depends. Depends on your point of view. But I'm saying that it's not an uncomplicated matter. Furthermore, we're charging toward an environment in which we're excusing ourselves from making these decisions. How? In the deal that was made between the leadership, the Republican leadership on the Hill and the President of the United States, we have something called sequestration, which is automatically at the end of the year going to slash all kinds of spending, including defense spending. That's the worst possible way to make a decision, by not making a decision. Societies have to choose. Do we want to do these things or not? Do we want to be in decline as a global power? Some people say yes, some people say no. But it's irresponsible to let it happen and not make the decision. That's what I would say. That's basically what I would argue. At least I got to hear your thoughts on this.
No, I agree that these are the kinds of choices that I think need to be made. But I'm not in any way for just a slash and burn right across the board. This is my problem. I feel like we have failed as not just a conservative movement, but as a country to contend with the real problems of the day. and I don't see that getting any better.
Right. And why am I more optimistic? Because I get to work with courageous policymakers, and since I've been in Washington, D.C., I've never seen as many people who are dedicated to making the principled case along the lines that I think is appropriate. It's better now. It's better now than when I came to Washington, D.C. It's better now than it was 10 years ago when I started paying attention to national policymaking in Washington, D.C.
But it's worse in terms of the polarization, right? I mean, there may be people, and I fully expect there's lots of people at AEI, and there's lots of people at the Brookings Institute, and there's lots of people on congressional staffs who are interested in making good policy and having the kind of discussions that I think we all three agree need to be had. But that really can't happen, doesn't happen in Congress, right?
Yeah, I mean, I want to speak in favor of polarization for a second, because nobody ever sticks up for polarization.
I'd support on polarization, but polarization that doesn't allow compromise, that doesn't allow discussion, that, as Lisa says, casts people out of the club if they deviate one iota. That's just not.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that it's unfortunate in a lot of the ways that politics gets in the way of progress. I understand that a lot.
I'm supporting politics. I'm supporting strong parties, all that stuff. But I think it's dysfunctional right now, don't you?
In some ways, but in many ways not. I look, back in history, we're not shooting at each other. I can vote against, look, guys, wait, look. Many of you have lived in other countries where you vote against the party that wins, there's a knock in the night. Stuff's no joke. Look, to not get along, conservatives need to stand their ground, as far as I'm concerned, right? They need to stand their ground on what really matters to them, because if they don't, for the sake of compromise, if they don't, for the sake of getting rid of polarization, you know what happens? We get that chart that shows GDP going to government, going all the way to the moon. That's the result of compromise. No, look, okay, I like to compromise. I like getting along. I don't want you to hate me. But I think there's a time to stand for principle, and America's a country that can stand for these types of working out of principle. I think adjudication is really healthy, and it's great. Thank you. Wow. That's great. Let's hear it for polarization. That's right.
This, I think, will be our last question.
Thank you. And thank you each for being here. It's been a wonderful afternoon. This question is related to a comment that Professor Dulac made regarding national security and in relation to the concept of conservatism. Conservation of our nation, preservation of our nation, national security is certainly a hot topic and has been, and I think being in the Maxwell School, it's even more relevant. How do each of you feel about, not necessarily economically, but that which we should put forth regarding national security in the interests of our nation, conserving it, preserving it?
I'm all for conserving our country, its resources, its monetary and human resources, and for protecting national security. I don't think that what we're doing in this world is improving my safety or the safety of this country. I think this country has swung way too far away from recognition and protection of civil liberties, and way too far away from that, and way too much toward an inappropriately interventionist foreign policy. Thank you.
I would add to that, and I probably agree with Lisa pretty much on that, that the military spending, you said don't talk about economics, but I think it's really important, and I think you have to. And I think military spending has been so tied up with politics and campaign contributions and the military-industrial complex, to quote Dwight Eisenhower, that it needs to be re-examined and scaled back. We can protect our security. We can do what we need to maintain a military at much less cost than we are spending.
You got the best applause line. It's unfair, and I'm not gonna give you a good applause line here. Look, I mean, I think that the United States. I don't know whether we should spend less or more on the military, because the whole thing is such a mess. The whole thing is such an ungodly mess. It's so much of the military budget is going toward not protecting the nation. So much of it is going toward keeping bases open that we don't need. So much of it is going toward equipment that's out of date. So much of it is going toward basically political boondoggles and waste that we don't know if we should spend more or we should spend less. I'm for an entirely modernized military that's completely up to date. I'm for paying soldiers a living wage and taking care of them after they defend our nation. And if we do that, that might cost more. And if it's true, I'll take it. Yeah.
So, you did find an applause line in there.
That's a pretty cheap way to end. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Let me say a couple quick things here at the end. We'll go out, we'll have our reception. There is food and drink, but there are also books that Arthur has written, including Gross National Happiness, so that you can boost his sales figures from 8 to, say, 15. We'll aim high. And I'm sure he'll be happy to sign them. The last thing I'll just say is thanks, Arthur, Christy, Lisa, for a really stimulating conversation.